All right, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Mark Agers, and I'm the director of the Institute for Child Development and Family Relations here at Cal State San Bernardino. We serve children, parents, and families in the inland region through research, education, and applied services. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Christina Hasija. She is a licensed clinical psychologist and professor at CSUSB. Dr. Hasija received her doctorate in clinical psychology from the University of Wyoming. She completed an APA-accredited predoctoral clinical internship at the VA Puget Sound Healthcare System, Seattle Division, which provided her with specialized training with diverse veteran populations with PTSD and comorbid conditions such as substance abuse disorders in residential and outpatient settings. Dr. Hasija received postdoctoral training at the National Center for PTSD through the VA Palo Alto Healthcare System and Stanford University. She obtained specialized experience working with veteran PTSD populations in outpatient mental health settings and via telemedicine. Dr. Hasija specializes in the treatment of psychological disorders, including PTSD, mood and anxiety disorders, and substance use disorders. As you can see, she has an extensive background in training, and I'm really excited to hear what she has to share with us today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Christina Hasija.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here to talk with you all today. I'd like to thank Dr. Mark Agers and the ICDFR for inviting me to come to speak with you all on this topic. I'm just going to be kind of going through a little bit about what some of the mental health impacts of COVID-19 are in terms of what we know to date. And then I'll talk a little bit about some things to keep an eye out for. And then we'll talk about specific, coping strategies and things that you can do to effectively manage the stress that we're kind of all collectively facing right now. So there has been a variety of impacts related to COVID-19, some of which I'm sure many of you are not strangers to. Obviously, chiefly illness, so dealing with the impacts of COVID-19, as well as, the impacts that the illness has had on individuals in our families. Because of the necessary requirements to engage in social distancing, that has left a number of us, some more profoundly impacted than others, with having to deal with isolation. Other impacts include changes in our daily lives, so having to adapt to perhaps a virtual world, having to adapt to a loss of childcare, having to adapt to a loss of social activities or other recreational activities that you were familiar or you were used to having the opportunity to engage in. Of course, there's more serious impacts that we have seen, like job loss and resulting financial hardships. Of course, the loss of life. We just recently crossed the 500,000 death toll mark. And just this ongoing sense of uncertainty. Are things getting better? Are the cases going down? Are there these new variants? What does that mean? How are we going to successfully get out of this situation? And so I am somewhat, I think that, at least in terms of where we're sitting and meeting today, it does seem like there are better days on our horizon, and I'm grateful and hopeful for that. But this has been, obviously, we're getting to the point where we're almost at the 1 year mark here, where we have been experiencing, all of these impacts and having to adapt to them fairly quickly, without necessarily the kinds of supports that we used to have readily available. And you add that to the fact that, this is a completely unprecedented time in our lives. Everybody on this Zoom today has not previously had to deal with a pandemic or the implications of it. So it's definitely uncharted territory. And I think we've all just been doing our best to kind of adapt, on the fly, so to speak. Early kind of research has kind of shown that, not surprisingly, there are significant mental health impacts associated with COVID-19 and the, kind of resulting consequences that I mentioned earlier. So research is still growing, but early findings do show that specifically anxiety and depressive disorders, substance use, and increased suicidal ideation have been observed among adults. What we know so far is that people that experienced more directly economic effects, so maybe going back to like job loss or financial hardship, more effects on their daily life, so thinking about having reduced access to social support, increased demands related to work or parenting, coping with illness, caring for family, those sorts of impacts on a person's daily life, as well as experiencing delays in academic activities or other kinds of goals, have been associated with greater anxiety as well. Having relatives or acquaintances with COVID-19 can potentially increase a person's risk for these kinds of mental health issues. And again, that's not surprising. We kind of know already that, especially with respect to experiencing stress and trauma, the more direct demands that are placed on the individual, as well as the more directly they're impacted by the event, the more likely you are to see a risk for mental health issues. Also, which has been kind of observed in the clinical literature for quite some time and in the medical field as well. Not surprisingly, young adults, ethnic minorities, essential workers, unpaid caregivers for adults, and those with pre-existing mental health conditions appear to be disproportionately affected. So there's specific populations that seem to be at greater risk, most namely, ethnic minorities. So I'm going to use a metaphor kind of a little bit throughout this presentation. I want you to think about, us as humans as being a lot like cars, right? So vehicles. Obviously, we all rely on our cars to take us where we need to go and perform a number of essential activities, whether that be for work, for school, for, again, recreation, for facilitating social relationships, things of that sort. So if you think of us all as cars, what does a car need to effectively run? Well, it needs gas, right? So, and maybe you've heard of this kind of metaphor before, in terms of humans being like cars and needing to have what we call a full gas tank. It's not surprising that what stress does, especially prolonged stress over time, it eliminates our reservoir, right? It keeps us functioning basically, without enough gas, so to speak. So what you have now is, now that we're getting to the point of 1 year of being kind of under these, somewhat unprecedented levels of stress, you find that essentially many people might feel that they're kind of, running on fumes, so to speak. And the problem with that is, although the car can still, take you where you need to go on empty, is that eventually if you don't attend to that blinking light telling you that you need gas, there is the opportunity for obviously, really negative consequences, much more negative when we're talking about people's mental health. So it can basically be a recipe for disaster. So unlike cars, we don't necessarily have a light that's going to blink and tell us whether or not there's something that needs to be checked, right? So what we have to do is kind of check in with ourselves and be receptive to feedback from other people that know us, that are in our support system, in terms of being able to gauge like how we're doing. So these, what are listed on this slide here, are kind of like those warning signs, so to speak. They're also just direct consequences of everything that I mentioned on the previous slide. So some of these signs include like experiencing depressed moods. So noticing that you're feeling down or depressed more often than not. Feeling increased anxiety, fear, or worry. So perhaps worrying that about your financial security, the safety of yourself or your family members, not being able, experiencing intrusive thoughts of worry or fear throughout the day. How am I going to get through this? What if I can't follow through on that responsibility or that obligation? How is this impacting my children? Do I have COVID? Did I get too close to that person? Was I exposed? How am I going to get an appointment? Et cetera, et cetera. So increased fear, anxiety, or worry. Also restlessness and irritability. So a lot of times when we think about somebody that might be in need of, perhaps receiving some kind of mental health care, we tend to often think about somebody that maybe is experiencing symptoms of anxiety or panic attacks or subjectively depressed mood, like feeling down or depressed, having difficulty getting out of bed. But it's important for people to know that there's other signs that are important to pay attention to as well. And those are signs of what we call irritability or restlessness. So, having difficulty being able to relax, being easily frustrated or short with others, getting into a lot of arguments, with people, in your home or at work. Those are signs that, again, that gas tank is low, and that's something that you want to pay attention to. Also, increased isolation. Now, I mentioned that isolation is a consequence of COVID because of physical distancing measures, but also it's important to pay attention to when you notice yourself or a loved one, isolating from your support groups, irrespective of COVID. So maybe they stop answering the phone. Maybe they, you find yourself hiding out in your bedroom more often, or not wanting to, spend time with your family downstairs, or watching a movie, or going outside for a hike. You just see withdrawal, social withdrawal, basically. So that's something that you want to pay attention to. Another important warning sign is anhedonia, and that basically just refers to having a kind of an inability to experience joy or pleasure. So if all of a sudden you find that things you really used to enjoy, maybe hobbies or activities, or going on walks with your dog, or painting or playing music, or even spending time with family and friends isn't as enjoyable, that's something that you want to take note of. Another common consequence of stress is impairments in concentration. So having difficulty focusing, having trouble making decisions, having trouble remembering things, feeling confused. So that is something that, again, you want to take note of. Appetite changes. So if you notice that you or somebody else, you notice a significant change in appetite, which could be, overeating or undereating. That's also a sign that there could be something going on. Worsening of chronic health issues. So if you have a pre-existing health issue, oftentimes what stress does is it exacerbates that. Sometimes you can also see stress result in the development of new health issues, or sometimes even headaches, stomach aches, gastrointestinal issues. So those are again, signs that, you might need to, either seek some type of outside help, or, engage in certain kinds of behaviors that can kind of fill your gas tank, so to speak. Increased substance use. I think this is something that I've at least seen reported in the news, that this is definitely a consequence, and they've certainly seen increased rates of substance use following COVID. But that's also a warning sign if you notice that you're using, substances more than you used to, that you're becoming more reliant on their use, or that their use is creating problems in your lives, that you'd want to pay attention to that. As well as lastly, suicidal ideation. Having suicidal thoughts, is not uncommon when people experience depression or anxiety or stress. But, so to a certain extent, it is something that is, I think, ubiquitous during certain times. But when it starts to occur, again, that's a warning sign. And certainly when you start to notice that you're having increasingly frequent, and intense suicidal thoughts, that's definitely a sign to, seek out some kind of help, communicate, to friends and family, what you're experiencing. So now I'm going to go through some kind of general strategies to kind of manage anxiety and stress during COVID. The first one noted here on the slide seems to be, somewhat intuitive, and it's kind of the more obvious one. But interestingly, I think it's one of the ones that most people pay least amount of attention to, especially when they're under a lot of stress. The most important thing that you can do is take care of your body and your just basic needs, which are, having proper nutrition, ensuring that you're getting adequate amounts of sleep. So generally for adults, that's about 8 hours a night, as well as engaging in regular exercise. So the interesting thing is we usually think of these things as being important to our physical health, but they're actually equally important to our mental health. In fact, sleep is a really important indicator of mental health. And when you see individuals that are, struggling with depression or anxiety, often, one of the kind of more observable, symptoms of those disorders is impaired sleep. So sleeping too much or sleeping too little or having distressing dreams or nightmares. So taking care of your body and just ensuring that you're doing just at least these 3 basic things, eating nutritious meals and snacks, sleeping 8 hours, as well as getting some kind of physical activity is really important. And I think for some people who may have been physically active in the past, it certainly has become, increasingly more difficult to utilize some forms of exercise that you may have relied on in the past. If you, for example, relied on, gyms and being able to go to the gym. A lot of gyms obviously have been closed, but trying to find as best of a way that you can engage in some kind of regular activity. Thankfully, we're fairly safe when we're outside and we're not around other people. So, thinking about, going for walks, going for runs, biking, hiking, getting outside is really important, and getting moving. Another really important strategy to manage right now, and I think that this has proven to be quite challenging for many people, given everything that has been going on within the past year related to the pandemic, as well as social issues and politics, is media distancing. We are constantly bombarded by information from the media. It comes to our phones, it comes on social media. Many people are now spending more time on the computer, right, for work or for their education. So we're constantly, being exposed to information. And of course, again, these are unprecedented times. So you're going to want to turn to the media to get information on how the situation is evolving, how it's being handled. But it's really important that you don't over-consume the news. Basically, you want to make sure that you're setting appropriate limits. So, for example, a good strategy might be to agree to set a daily time limit for you to watch the news, or decide maybe I'm going to look through recent news articles or read the newspaper in the morning, or I'm going to check it once in the afternoon, that sort of thing. Because what that constant bombardment of information, especially again, given everything else that we have kind of seen in the news in the last year, is it can be very taxing, and it can, certainly serve to elevate, feelings of anxiety, stress, hopelessness, anger, uncertainty. So you want to, dose that. And that's not usually something that we're used to like having to limit, or that we think about having to limit, but it's important to do that. Also try to focus on goals and identify new sources of enjoyment and meaning. So it's really important basically to spend time on activities or sources of meaning that matter to you and that you enjoy. So you might already have some of these things, like, for example, I was mentioning earlier, hobbies like playing an instrument, creating some kind of art, exercising, hiking, spending time with family. These are things you certainly want to do. And if you are particularly struggling, or if your ability to do some of these things has been compromised because of COVID, you might want to find new things that you can do that can provide a sense of satisfaction or enjoyment. And it's really important to make time to do these things. I think sometimes when we're stressed out, we can have, a lot of things on our plate, a lot of things to do. You're thinking about household responsibilities and finances and caring for for family members, that it's really easy to forget that it's actually really important. And it's one of the best ways you can kind of fill that gas tank, so to speak, is to have some time where you're engaged in an activity that you enjoy and makes you feel good. So good things to do during COVID might be like having a movie night, reading a new book, exploring a hobby online, and even planning maybe how you're going to do that or what you're going to do, when the restrictions are lifted. But focus on identifying things that you enjoy that, provide you with a sense of satisfaction. Another important strategy is try to maintain your normal routine as best as possible. So anytime we're under a lot of stress, again, it's really easy to, not eat, not sleep, stop doing things that you do regularly, like exercise, spending time reaching out to friends and family. You really want to do your best to maintain your normal routine as much as possible. However, there is a caveat to that. You also want to provide a little bit of space, because when you're under a lot of stress, it might be difficult to fully accomplish everything that you would under normal circumstances. So you want to have some kind of a regular routine, but still allow some flexibility, because these are unprecedented times, right? There is going to be a day where maybe a family member calls you and tells you that they're not feeling well, or you find out you have to go get tested, or there's something happening on the news that's stressful. So you want to have some flexibility, but generally you want to have a reliable wake up time, a regular time that you're going to bed, a regular time that you're kind of eating your meals, to the extent that you want to engage in certain activities regularly, like household chores or exercises. That all can be, really helpful to kind of come up with a plan and try to kind of stick with it. Another important strategy is engaging in stress reduction activities and self-care. So these are things like meditation, mindfulness, even stretching and deep breathing exercises. These can be really important ways to kind of restore our bodies and help our bodies, kind of reduce the amount of stress. There's a lot of resources available. Obviously, mindfulness has been really growing, as well as meditation in the past decade or so. There's a lot of great resources you can find online through a simple Google search, or if you have access to, a cell phone, there's a lot of great apps available that can help guide you through this process. But even just simple stretching and taking a moment to step outside and kind of be mindful and attend to like what's around you, and take a moment to take in the space and world around you, can be a nice way to reset, as well as kind of cope with stress. Another important strategy is, challenging negative thoughts. A really common, experience for people with anxiety and depressive issues is having negative thoughts. Thoughts related to worry or fear. I'm not going to get out of this. My life is never going to be the same. I'm not going to get through this. Or thoughts like, I'm weak. I should be able to handle this. What's wrong with me? Everybody else seems to be doing fine. Our minds are constantly chattering. So it's really important that you try to, I think, do one of two things or a combination. You want to certainly challenge negative thoughts, and challenging a negative thought isn't so simple as just when a family or friend tells you think optimistically. It's not just thinking optimistically. I like to think of it as thinking realistically as well as compassionately. So a lot of times, if you get stuck in that negative thinking style, think about what you would tell a friend, right? Think about how you'd respond to a family member if they told you that. Oftentimes, when family or friend come to us with kind of extreme, negative thoughts, because we're outside of the situation, we're able to provide, a more accurate representation of what's happening, as well as a more compassionate response. So try to challenge, those negative thoughts, like recognizing, what, this is a really hard time and I'm doing the best that I can. Or, what, everybody is going through this right now. It's a hard time for everybody. Or I can get through this. Or I need to take care of myself. Try to challenge those negative thoughts. The other strategy I mentioned might just be to just ignore them. These are just, like I said, our minds are constantly chattering, and it's okay to not buy into those thoughts, right? View those thoughts as just a symptom of stress, and you don't have to play into them, and you don't have to accept them as being true. Just kind of continue on with, what you need to do, what you want to do, while trying to, obviously engage in some of these other strategies I'm mentioning. Another important thing is setting up a virtual support group or identifying a bubble, so to speak, finding friends and family that you can, reach out to, rely on, and have regular, social interaction. I think that, the experience during COVID has been, obviously unique for each individual. Some people were used to seeing a lot of family and friends and getting their social needs met at work, and now they find themselves at home and isolated. Some people might find that, all of a sudden they're home or with their family or with kids all the time, and that could be challenging as well. But it's really important to have people that you can reach out to, that you can have some kind of regular social interaction with. And I want to qualify it by saying you specifically want to reach out to, I think, during stressful times, with people that are going to be supportive, that are going to be able to understand, kind of what you're dealing with and what your concerns are. So it's important to, I think, have a healthy support group, and it's okay to not also spend times with people that aren't helpful, when you're, dealing with, a particularly stressful situation. The next point is, exercising compassion to self and others. So I kind of alluded to that earlier when I was using that example of like telling yourself what you would tell a friend, but be patient with yourself. These are unprecedented times. Everybody is struggling, and just because you're struggling, it doesn't mean that you're weak, and it doesn't mean that, things are not necessarily going to get better. So try to be patient with yourself as well as with other people that you work with or in your family as well. Next, find ways to help others. So whether that be through volunteering or helping your neighbors or family members or elderly members of your community, these can be really, really helpful ways to, again, one, obviously help those individuals, but also, ensure that your gas tank is being filled, so to speak. It provides a sense of purpose and meaning. I would just be cautious in terms of feeling like you need to help everybody and take on more than you feel comfortable with. We talked a little bit, we haven't really talked so much about like self-care, but you hear that term a lot. And a lot of people think about self-care as having to be specific to doing something nice for yourself, getting a massage, taking a bubble bath, eating a nice meal. Those are all important ways to fill our gas tank as well. But there's also other, really important pieces of self-care, which is, knowing when to say no to certain things that you're not comfortable with, knowing how to set boundaries with people that you find unsupportive or perhaps toxic, knowing even sometimes that it might be time to turn the Netflix off at 11:38 because you need to get your rest. Those are also important things, to be doing. And the final strategy here is ask for support and help. Don't be afraid to reach out to other people. Sometimes even just having a very brief conversation with a friend or family member can really help kind of put things into perspective and provide, some temporary or short-term, relief. So don't be afraid to ask for help. And kind of what I've got here on the last slide are some references. So if you or somebody in your family or friend or workplace, if you start to notice that, they do seem to be struggling, these are great resources to provide. Obviously, some of you are from the larger San Bernardino community. So the San Bernardino County Behavioral Health They have a number of great resources on their website, as does the National Alliance for Mental Illness. So those are good resources as well. If you're from the CSUSB campus, if you're a student, services are available through the Counseling and Psychological Services, or CAPS. You pay for those with your student fees. And the psychology department also has a community counseling center that is offering services via telehealth. That's an option to, students, faculty, staff, alumni, and members of the community. So that's all I've got for now. So I'll go ahead and open it up for questions.
Christina, that was terrific. Thank you so much for all that you shared. I think, one of the points you made early on just about how long this experience has gone on, right? That we've been going through COVID now and the sort of effects of that isolation and life change and hardships, et cetera. But the length of time at which all this has gone on has really created, I think, a lot of mental health challenges and for many of us. And so I really appreciate you taking the time to kind of share your perspective on that, as well as, some of the strategies that folks can use to sort of think about that and help themselves and the people that they love in their own lives. So thank you for that. I do have a number of questions that participants and audience members have brought up. Okay, so Christina, the first one I wanted to pass to you speaks to something sort of early on that you mentioned in your talk. And you had a section where you talked quite a bit about kind of different warning signs that we should be looking for, both in ourselves and sort of those around us. But one of the participants asked, how do we kind of determine the difference between what is just maybe a typical change in one of those indicators that you mentioned versus whether it's, kind of something more serious, something more to be more concerned about?
Yeah, that's a great question. And also, it's important to keep in mind that everybody is going to experience some fluctuations, right? So you might have a period of a day or two where you feel more down, or you do feel more anxious, or maybe there is something happening on the news or in your family environment that's stressful. So there's going to be kind of, obviously periods where you see, kind of transitory increases in distress and things like that. I think where it really starts to become concerning is when you see it happening for a prolonged period of time. So, when you start to notice that you are having difficulty sleeping, and this is going on for, 1 week, 2 weeks, even longer, that's a very telling sign that, there might be something going on that needs to be addressed, as well as with respect to, experiences of depression or sadness. It's not uncommon to feel down or hopeless a day or two, right? But when you start to notice that a person is feeling down or depressed most of the day, nearly every day for, 2 weeks or so, that's kind of the diagnostic definition. That's a sign to really pay attention to that. As well, again, if you start to see suicidal thoughts coming up, and again, really significant feelings of, profound feelings of hopelessness. When you feel like you just, when you can't shake it, I think that's a good way to think about it. When you start to see withdrawal, when you start to see, significant changes in appetite and sleep, those are really important things to pay attention to for ourselves, and our loved ones.
No, that's great. That's great. Thank you for that. A number of our participants asked questions about school-aged children and students, and so I'm going to kind of combine a couple together. But I guess the main point is that folks kind of want to know how do we assist school-aged children or students who might be struggling with their mental health.
Well, I think you're going to want to rely on a lot of the strategies, I mentioned, and then just, to a certain extent, you want to adapt them for kids and school age children a little bit. I think one important thing is that, kids don't often always express their distress in the same ways that adults do. So I think that's the biggest difference. If you are sad or anxious or depressed, it's very common that, of course, there's individual differences and cultural differences, but, we can very clearly communicate, I'm feeling sad, I haven't been able to sleep, kids don't necessarily do that. And so it's really important, to pay attention to these same things, how they're eating, how they're sleeping, as well as specifically whether or not you seem to notice that they're having, a lot of somatic complaints, a lot of headaches, a lot of stomach aches. But you'll see a lot of those same behaviors, feeling withdrawn, not really, experiencing as much enjoyment. Also, sometimes you might see, I talked about like restless and irritability in adults. You see that, and you can see manifestations of that in kids as well. Not just with irritability, but perhaps maybe they might be pushing boundaries more, or maybe acting out in ways behaviorally or responding emotionally in a way that they typically wouldn't. So those are things that you want to pay attention to, and it's also just okay to talk to your child and check in and see how they're doing. Sometimes, kids only hear bits and pieces of what's going on, and they might be privy to what's on the news or like adult conversations. And again, these are unprecedented times, and there's been lots of things that have been, really concerning and scary, but it's going to be even more so, I think, to a child. It could potentially be more so, so it's really important to talk to them about what's going on in a way that's going to be supportive. So you don't necessarily have to lie about what's going on, but talk to them in a way that can potentially correct any extreme or exaggerated kind of misperceptions about what they might have. They might hear you talking about COVID, and they might think like, oh my gosh, if we get COVID, my parents are going to die and I'm going to be, you know what I mean? And so that catastrophic thinking, can lead to, obviously really, really pronounced effects. So it's really important to talk to them, I think, factually at, I'm going to say at a developmentally appropriate level. Right. But, because if you don't talk about it with kids, then you just leave them to their imagination. And that, in many cases, even with adults too, oftentimes that's far worse than, the situation at hand. So, you want to check in with them as well. I'm not sure if that answered the whole question.
No, I think you did, and I think you went beyond, right, in a really important way in talking about what some of the things we can do to prevent the sort of escalation of those concerns, et cetera, that might emerge in children, especially younger ones. So I really appreciate that. We did have a speaker earlier in the year who
yes, I remember.
Talking to your children, right, about COVID. And that was one of the things they talked about. It's like, if you're not sharing with them, they're getting information from other sources, whether they're overhearing your conversations or something popped up on TV or on a screen that they had. And that could create much more severe concerns or thoughts. I think
it's a really important thing, just to say one more thing, because I think intuitively as like parents and caregivers, sometimes you might feel the need to like protect your child from information. So maybe you don't tell them what's going on, but it's a delicate balance, because oftentimes then that can lead to extra, additional uncertainty and fear and anxiety. So finding a way to keep them in the loop, again, in a developmentally appropriate way. So, they don't need to necessarily know that, their grandparent might die if they get COVID, right? But letting them know that, this is a serious thing that's happening, and, a lot of people are being impacted, but I'm doing what I can to keep you safe. Do you have any questions? That's helpful.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. Thank you. We got a couple of questions that sort of related to folks who might say have pre-existing conditions entering kind of the COVID situation. So one person was asking about generalized anxiety disorder, another one about PTSD. But for folks who, prior to COVID were experiencing, either PTSD or generalized anxiety disorder, do you have any recommendations or thoughts about their experiences to the extent that they might be sort of accentuated or exacerbated in the context of COVID?
Yeah, actually, I meant to mention that earlier on when I was going through kind of some of the impacts. But what research has shown, not surprisingly, is that individuals that do have pre-existing mental health conditions have been more adversely impacted because of COVID. And again, that's not surprising. Just general life stress can be more problematic for people with existing mental health conditions, and certainly an event of or experience of, on this scale well and for this amount of time. And then again, thinking about, some people's care has been interrupted, some people's, the things that they normally do to kind of keep themselves, taken care of, like spending time with friends and family, those things have been impacted. So certainly, and what the research has shown so far is that those individuals are disproportionately affected. And so I think a good thing to do is certainly if you have a pre-existing mental health condition, it is a really great time to, if you're not already, to connect to some kind of mental health support, especially if you're noticing that your symptoms, are worsening. I think it's also a good idea to just kind of check in with yourself. I don't think we're also used to necessarily doing that, asking yourself, how am I doing? And then following up with, no, really, how am I doing? Check in with yourself, and also, sometimes it's hard to hear feedback from like family and friends, but they know you, and they sometimes can be in a better position to observe if something isn't right. So, check in with, be open to, I guess, to that feedback, from family and friends, because chances are, when you're in that state, you don't always necessarily have, full awareness of everything else. I mean, but the consequences are pretty pronounced. For example, there have been some studies that have looked at, rates of anxiety, depression, compared to the year prior. So of course, we won't get into research methods, but there's a lot of problems with just necessarily doing that comparison. But my guess is that there is some, accuracy in these data, and what they're showing is that people with the prevalence of anxiety disorders is 3 times higher.
Wow.
The prevalence of depressive disorders is 4 times higher. About a quarter of individuals are reporting traumatic stress types of symptoms. There was another study from the CDC, a survey study that showed, and this was conducted in January, and it showed that about 40% of adults are reporting an anxiety or depressive disorder. About 40%. So think about it; it's about half, right? So I mean, that's really prevalent. And again, I think at some point we need to also work to, reduce stigma about mental illness generally, but that's a separate conversation. But these are experiences that are pretty prevalent under normal circumstances. So you can only imagine, how high the prevalence might be right now.
One of the questions that came up, and you spoke to some of this earlier, but if you could maybe can expand on that a little bit. It's one of the most fundamental things, right? A person asked, and I could have asked this same question, right? How do we manage, irritability and feelings of isolation that come up due to being at home? That's a theme. I mean, it was a great question that someone asked. That's a theme I've heard so many people share just, in my own personal life, right? This idea that I'm just more irritable. I'm just feeling isolated. And I don't know. I know you spoke to this a little bit, but if there was anything else that you could add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, irritability, they're a little bit, I'm going to speak about them separately, I guess, but
yeah.
Irritability, I think, is a really important sign to pay attention to, that you are, overtaxed, right? When we're stressed out, when we're running late, when things aren't going right, when we have deadlines, when we're worried about friends and family, it's not uncommon to be more irritable. You combine that with also not eating well or not sleeping. And so, I think with respect to irritability, you really want to take that as a sign that you need to try to do something that's going to be restorative to you. And that's going to be unique to each individual. So these are all different strategies. And what I would encourage you to do is, to try a variety of the things that I've mentioned today. Not necessarily one coping mechanism is going to work for every person. It's not a one size fits all. Some people exercise, they need that, for other people, it's sleep, or it's spending time with friends and family. For some people, meditation is really helpful. Some people, they find it they get frustrated with it, So you have to find what's going to work best for you in that moment. And the best place to be in is where you have a variety of skills or strategies to choose from. You don't want to be over reliant on just one coping skill, right? Because if for some reason you're unable to do that, right? Like maybe it was going to the gym and now you can't go to the gym, then you're going to not have anything else to draw on. But also I think the efficacy of our coping skills, can sometimes be, I think, more pronounced when, we have a number of different things to kind of choose from. So I think with respect to irritability, I would first, again, focus on sleep, as well as I think, if it's maybe because you need some space for yourself, maybe it's finding some time to take care of yourself or do something that's relaxing or enjoyable. It might also mean that you have to, we didn't talk about this too much, but these are really stressful times. I keep saying that, but when a person's under a lot of stress, you want to try find ways to eliminate the stress. So of course we have things that we have to do that are essential to, our personal situations, our households, our work, our school, whatever it is. But now's not necessarily the time where you should feel like you need to take on things that are extra, or if you have things that you were usually doing that were somewhat extra, maybe you need to step back from those. And that's not a sign of weakness or failure. It's just the reality of the situation. Maybe now is not a good time to coach your son's little league. Maybe now is not a good time, to agree to, coordinate some kind of, work event or take on extra service at work or to commit to, helping, your son's school out right now or whatever it might be, but it's also okay not just to say no to things that we don't necessarily want to do, or even if we want to do them, we still have to sometimes have the awareness to be like, I want to do that, but I probably shouldn't do that right now. But also being okay to let go of the things that we can, you can get back to that. I mean, hopefully, I'm feeling increasingly optimistic personally, but, we are going to get through this at some point, whether it's by, summer or fall, it does seem like there's a light at the end of the tunnel. So, I guess, try to focus on that and know that even if you let go of some things right now, it doesn't mean that you can't get back into it. But, it's difficult too, because sometimes people might stop doing things or let go of responsibilities because they're depressed. So you kind of have to pay attention. It's really about paying attention to what your body and your mind, kind of need. But yeah. The other thing was irritability. What was the other? Sorry.
Oh, isolation.
Isolation. Yeah. I think some people definitely need to be more intentional than others about, engaging regularly with people. I think that's important. We're social beings. It's how we refuel. It's how we form connection. It's so essential to, who we are as humans. And so, trying to, reach out to family or friends, if you can't see people in person, setting up Zoom activities are really helpful. And sometimes, I think, you have to pay attention to, I guess, a good piece of advice to be with socially, because it might be maybe you need to isolate, maybe you don't need to isolate. Pay attention to how you feel after you spend time with people. Sometimes it might be oh, I don't really know if I want to go on that Zoom, or I don't really want to go talk on my driveway with the person in my bubble, right? Mm-hmm. But notice how you feel afterwards when you do that, and use that as a guide, because I think, you also, and that's with any activity, check in with yourself. Did that make me feel better? Did that make me feel worse? And trust your own intuition, I think.
We got a couple questions about motivation, which I think is kind of interesting. And I don't know that you've directly spoken to this yet, but certainly it's sort of implicated in some of the things that you have discussed. But I'll use one of the specific comments around motivation to kind of frame the question. Someone writes, as a school counselor, my biggest challenge are students who are completely unmotivated. They're failing most or all of their classes. They're unreachable, right? Not checking emails or answering calls. And do you have guidance for helping them? And I would say, I know the question came framed from a school counselor, but I think parents have that same question, right? And so, I wonder if you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think this has, been particularly hard. I mentioned earlier on young adults, but kids as well.
Yeah.
Because of the reduced access to socialization and activities, and of course, having to adapt to virtual learning. So I think it's definitely good to pay attention to signs of that within your kids. And I think with respect to how to increase motivation, I think to the one of the most helpful things might be maybe very simple, but check in with the person and try to form some kind of appropriate, obviously, connection or relationship. Ask them how they're doing, because there might be things that you can do to kind of what might be causing, I guess, their reduction in motivation can be many things. So you don't want to assume that you necessarily know why, but if it's stemming from anxiety, if it's stemming from hopelessness, or it's just like, I don't like this learning model, then once you get the person talking about it, or to verbalize some of that, then you can try to introduce some kind of problem solving sorts of dialogue. So figuring out how you can perhaps make the learning environment better. So maybe it's about scheduling more breaks, or trying to see if they can get a peer or a small peer group together, like a study group, or finding more ways to connect with other individuals in their class or with the material. But it's kind of hard to know, I guess, without knowing kind of what might be leading that. I think sometimes also just low motivation, I think it comes from a lot of uncertainty and hopelessness, or, feeling like efforts are just kind of futile, or I can't learn this way. I can't do this. I don't want to do this. And so some of that could obviously be addressed through, either formal mental health services, or also, just, again, talking to the person, trying to provide reassurance and support. That can really go a long way. Even among, obviously my area is the traumatic stress. And one of the most significant predictors of resilience is social support. And it's just so incredibly important that we have access to that. And I think that can go a long way, as well as, trying to see if there is something, specific in the learning environment that they're struggling with, and if there's opportunity to improve it. And hopefully also, I think we're hearing more rumblings about schools reopening. And so I think that's something to be optimistic for, but also something I think to potentially be prepared for, because, the learning environment is going to be different, than what students were used to. So I think it's good to prepare students for that, or prepare your children for that, so that they know what to expect. Yeah. Many of us did that work back in the fall when we thought that we were going back. But now that we're going back, I was just telling my son the other day, because I'm hearing he might be going back unofficially next month. And, he's only 7. So I think he was thinking it from, his own prior experience of school. And I kind of had to remember what we talked about in fall, how you're going to go for half day. And, so, you want to make sure that people have reasonable expectations for what that's going to look like. And we might not know what that's going to look like. We don't even know a date officially yet, but for some of us. But, to the extent that you can just, I think the best thing to do is to try to prepare a person as much as possible. And then just, try to do your best to listen and to troubleshoot, and to also, just recognize too that, it's okay if they're struggling. Yeah. Everybody's struggling,
Yeah, no, I appreciate you speaking to that and recognizing that it's kind of it's a broader issue beyond just the student or the child themselves, right? I feel like, so many of the parents I talk to who have school-age children are all reporting this sort of challenge to like keep their kids engaged and motivated. The people who I know who are educators at the K-12 level are talking about how difficult and frustrating it is to stay engaged with the folks. So, it's clearly it's been a pretty big challenge, but I really appreciate your point. It's like, there are things that we can do as educators, there are things we can do as counselors, there are things we can do as parents around that.
Yeah.
Okay, we are getting close to time, but there was one last question I wanted to sneak in. If you got a minute left, sure. Christina. Okay, wonderful. Because it's a really, I think it's a fitting question too for us to kind of finish up on, which is, do you have any expectations or suggestions or about what's going to happen as we move out of COVID, right? And once sort of, I don't want to say return to normal, because I don't think that's the right way to frame what's going to happen. But this idea of as we move out of this sort of, more strict and COVID, constricted world that we've been in, are there mental health concerns or things that we should be thinking about?
I think that that's an excellent question. And I think we should be thinking about it. And I've actually been thinking about it myself because, it's been almost a year, and let's all give ourselves a pat on the back for we've all been forced to adapt one way or another, right? So we have been adapting, and in some ways, some things may have become a little bit easier, some things not so much, but some things you may have been able to successfully adapt and adjust. Mm-hmm. And I think, we're so focused on, obviously, we all want to get, quote unquote, back to normal. And, I think in some ways it's a good thing that it's not going to happen overnight. And this is partly related to your question, because either way, it's still going to be a really huge shift. And I don't think people are going to be prepared for that part. Even when you think about, for people working at home, right? We haven't had to battle traffic. Some people haven't had to put on anything other than sweatpants. We haven't had to think about what we're going to make for dinner, or maybe you can step out for 30 minutes where you can't do that when you're working from afar. Same thing, even just lives fundamentally kind of came to a stop, right? So think about parents, kids had sporting events and they had birthday parties and you had family parties and obligations and, your own recreational pursuits and life was stressful before. So as much as we so desperately want it back, it was still stressful. And I think adjusting back, it's good that it's gradual, and I hope that it is, because I think that that's going to be a lot to adapt to as well, because this has kind of become a new normal where we've been able to have a little more flexibility with respect to work or school or our relationships, right? You don't have to feel bad. I mean, of course you might because of, anyway, you don't have to necessarily feel bad turning down a social invitation. You have an out, right? So things like that, I think people could run the risk of maybe taking on, too much, or it might feel kind of shocking to all of a sudden be like, wait, I don't know how I used to get everybody dressed, get breakfast, go to school, go to work, leave early, go to soccer, make dinner. As stressful as life is right now, that was my personal experience before. I don't have to do a lot of, it doesn't feel it's a very different experience. I would say it's definitely still stressful, but it's a different kind of stress. And I think that, you want to be mindful of that adjusting back and recognize that can be stressful too. Anytime there's this change, a significant change, whether it's a good change or a bad change, there can be, you need to allow time for your mind and your body to kind of adapt. So even when things open up, you still want to kind of check in with yourself, be gentle, be compassionate, et cetera.
Yeah, I was thinking too that, right, we've sort of spent the last year thinking, being in groups of people, being out, that's a dangerous thing. And as we go back to more of that and that becomes more of what's normal, that in and of itself could create some challenges for folks.
Oh, yes, that too. And I think especially for people that had, any kind of pre-existing anxiety disorder, especially like obsessive compulsive disorder, for those individuals, I think it's going to be really trying to going back to starting to feel safe in situations that you might have already thought were unsafe, pre-COVID. So I think that's going to be a reality for some individuals as well, and for everybody. We're going to have to, you hear people anecdotally make comments about how weird it is to watch TV and movie shows, TV shows and movies and see people in such close proximity to one another. And I think everyone's going to have a little bit of discomfort with that. Depending on to what extent you have been really preoccupied with germs or, proper ventilation and COVID and whatnot. So, I think it's also okay to recognize that you're going to feel anxious for a while in those situations because it's adaptive, because you learned that was something associated with really negative consequences. So you had to adjust your brain and your mind and your behavior to adapt to those situations. And now you kind of have to adapt back. And it's not going to happen overnight. You might find yourself in a really crowded room, and you might have an experience of anxiety, I think rather than trying to, make a judgment about yourself, like what's wrong with me or why am I experiencing, to just be patient and know that like a big change is happening, when we get to that point, and that things that were previously associated with safety all of a sudden became associated with danger, things we take for granted, like hugging a grandparent, you know what I mean? Or so, we have to be patient in allowing our brains to kind of readjust back, I think.
No, that's great. Thank you for that really thoughtful answer. And really thank you for your entire presentation today. I know we're a little bit long, so my apologies both to you, Christina, as well as to our audience. We just had so many interesting things. And for those who sent a question and we didn't get to it, I apologize. We just didn't have the time for everything. But I hope still that everyone got a lot out of today's talk. So I would just like to say again, my sincere thanks to our speaker, Dr. Christina Hesija, for sharing her wisdom and her expertise today. So much good stuff to take from this. So with that, again, my thanks. Have a wonderful day and be well.
Thank you for participating in this webinar hosted by the Institute for Child Development and Family Relations at California State University, San Bernardino, providing guidance for parents and families based on science and best practice since 2002.